When I was in 8th grade, my science teacher organized what was supposed to be a fun and educational trip to the Greenwood Zoological Park. It wasn't really a zoo in the traditional sense. It was more like a combination of a nature reserve and a rundown roadside attraction. My classmates were excited about the trip because it meant a day out of school. I wasn't. I'd always hated zoos, the smell, the cages, the way the animals' eyes followed you. But even I wasn't prepared for what we found at Greenwood. The bus pulled up to a cracked parking lot where weeds pushed through the asphalt. The entrance gate leaned at an angle, its paint chipped and flaking. A faded sign overhead read, "Welcome to Greenwood Zoological Park, where nature comes alive." The letters looked like they'd been painted decades ago. Inside, the pathways were uneven, and the enclosures looked empty. At first, I thought the place had shut down years ago. Then a man appeared. He was tall, thin, and dressed in a filthy zookeeper's uniform. His name tag was too smudged to read. His eyes, though gray and glassy, seemed to sink into his skull. "Welcome, children," he said, his voice cracked and dry. "The animals have been waiting. I thought it was a joke." But there was no smile on his face. We followed him along winding paths. Some enclosures had animals, but they weren't right. In the reptile house, a massive snake lay coiled in its tank. But when I looked closely, I realized its scales were patchy. Parts of its skin were missing, revealing gray flesh underneath like it was rotting alive. The birdhouse wasn't any better. A row of cages held parrots and cockatoos, but their feathers were dull, falling out in clumps. They didn't make a sound, not even a squawk. They just stared, unblinking. One of the kids asked what was wrong with them. "They're just tired," the zookeeper whispered. "The night keeps them busy." We stopped for lunch in a picnic area surrounded by trees. The staff hadn't provided food, so we ate the bagged lunches we'd brought. I remember watching the zookeeper standing at the edge of the woods, staring into the shadows between the trees. He wasn't eating. He wasn't moving. Just staring. When our teacher asked if he was okay, he turned, smiled for the first time, and said, "The shadows are hungry." That's when the unease turned to dread. After lunch, he led us to the main attraction, a building at the far end of the zoo, its windows blacked out, its doors locked with heavy chains. "This is where the real ones are," he said, "the ones we don't let out during the day." Our teacher shook her head, insisting it was too dangerous, that it wasn't part of the trip. But the zookeeper pulled out a ring of keys and slid the chains loose. Inside, the air was freezing. The walls were lined with glass enclosures, but they weren't filled with animals. They were filled with things. The first enclosure held something that looked like a wolf, except its face was wrong. Its eyes were too wide, its snout twisted, its teeth jagged like shards of glass. It paced back and forth, never blinking, never looking away from us. Another held what looked like a person, but its limbs were bent backwards, its mouth sewn shut. It pressed its face against the glass, leaving smears of dark fluid as it watched us. And then, in the largest enclosure, there was nothing at all. Just shadows. But as we stared, the shadows began to move. Shapes formed. Claws, teeth. Dozens of eyes blinking in and out of existence. The zookeeper turned to us and said, almost lovingly, "This is their zoo. We are the exhibits." That's when the lights went out. The darkness swallowed everything. Kids screamed. I felt someone grab my wrist, Kyle, the same friend from my other trips, and he yanked me toward the exit. But in the blackness, I heard the glass shattering, and then the sounds, growls, screeches, the tearing of flesh. We ran blindly, crashing into walls, slipping on something wet. I didn't want to think about what it was. The zookeeper's voice followed us through the dark, calm and steady. "You can't leave. You belong here now." We burst through the doors into daylight, gasping for air. Only a handful of us made it out. Our teacher was gone. Most of the class was gone. The zookeeper stood in the doorway, blood dripping down his chin. He raised one hand and waved. Then the doors slammed shut. The police searched Greenwood after we reported it. But they found nothing. The enclosures were empty. The zookeeper was gone. And according to county records, the zoo had been shut down for over 20 years. They called us hysterical kids with overactive imaginations. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, at night, I hear the parrots squawking outside my window. Sometimes I wake up to see shadows moving in the corners of my room. And once, just once, I looked out my window and saw him. the zookeeper, standing at the edge of the woods, smiling. When I was 16, my history teacher, Mrs. Hale, decided our class would visit a historical landmark just outside our town. She never told us exactly where until the bus started driving into the countryside, past farmland, past rows of pines, until a looming structure appeared on the horizon. It was an abandoned asylum. The building sat on top of a hill, a sprawling mass of red brick and shattered windows. Its roof sagged in places, ivy crept along its walls, and a rusted chain-link fence surrounded the property. A crooked sign out front read, Westbrook State Hospital, established 1892. The moment we pulled up, half the class groaned. We'd all heard rumors about the place, how it had been shut down in the 70s after patients went missing, how people claimed to see lights in the windows at night, how ghost hunters dared each other to spend the night there and never lasted. This is unsafe. One of the parents who'd volunteered as a chaperone whispered, but Mrs. Hale just smiled stiffly. It's all been cleared with the district, she assured us, but I could tell from the way her hands trembled that she wasn't convinced herself. We entered through the main doors, their hinges shrieking like an animal in pain. Inside was worse. The air was damp, heavy with mildew. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips. The tiled floor cracked and uneven. Broken gurneys and rusted wheelchairs sat abandoned in the hallways, covered in dust. Our assignment was to take notes on the architecture and history, but no one cared about that. Everyone was too distracted by the feeling that we were being watched. I'll admit, at first I thought it was just my imagination. The place was creepy, sure, but it was empty, or at least it should have been. We split into groups to explore. My group included me, my best friend Kyle, and two other kids, Rachel and Brian. We wandered down a hallway lined with doors, each leading to patient rooms. Most were empty, just bare bed frames, broken glass, and mold creeping up the walls. But one room was different. The door was shut. Unlike the others, its handle wasn't rusted. In fact, it looked almost new. Kyle, being the idiot he was, twisted the knob and shoved it open. Inside was a single chair, perfectly centered in the room. Leather straps hung from its arms, cracked but intact, and on the floor beneath it were deep scratches, as if someone had tried to claw their way free. That's messed up, Rachel muttered, backing away. I wanted to follow her, but I couldn't stop staring at the chair. For just a second, I swore I saw someone sitting there, a shadowy figure thrashing against the restraints. But when I blinked, the chair was empty. We regrouped in the lobby, and that's when Mrs. Hale realized two kids were missing, Leah and Marcus. At first, she tried to stay calm, insisting they'd just wandered off. But when we retraced our steps down the hallways, they weren't anywhere. Their voices didn't echo when we called their names. The asylum swallowed every sound. The chaperones argued about calling the police, but our cell phones had no signal inside. Mrs. Hale sent one parent back to the bus to radio for help. The rest of us kept searching. That's when we found the basement stairs. The air grew colder as we descended. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, beams catching on old pipes and dangling wires. At the bottom was a heavy steel door. Kyle, of course, pushed it open. The smell hit us first, damp earth, rust, and something metallic that made my stomach twist. The basement was lined with cells. Rusted bars, rotting cots, more straps hanging from the walls. And then, from the far end, we heard it, a voice whispering, "Help me." It was Leah. We ran toward it, our footsteps echoing, hearts pounding. But when we reached the last cell, it was empty. Just a broken cot and claw marks gouged into the cement. Rachel screamed, because in the corner, half hidden in the shadows, something moved. It looked like a person, crouched low to the ground, but its limbs were too long. Its head tilted unnaturally, jerking side to side like a broken puppet, and then it smiled. Not with lips, those were torn away, but with rows of teeth too many to count. We bolted. I don't even remember how we got out of the basement. I just remember the sound, metal scraping on stone, footsteps that weren't quite human chasing us up the stairs. When we burst back into the lobby, everyone was screaming. The chaperone who'd gone to the bus was gone. The front doors were chained shut from the inside. We were trapped. Mrs. Hale was sobbing, clutching her crucifix necklace, muttering prayers under her breath. Kyle grabbed me by the arm and dragged me down another hallway, saying we had to find another exit. That's when we saw them, Leah and Marcus, standing at the end of the hall. But something was wrong. Their skin was gray, their eyes pure black. They opened their mouths in unison, and the exact same whisper echoed from both. Stay. We didn't. We crashed through a side door, splinters flying, and tumbled out into the overgrown courtyard. From there we scrambled over the fence, tearing our clothes, cutting our skin, but we didn't care. When we finally made it back to the bus, only half the class was there. The others never came out. Neither did Mrs. Hale. The police searched for weeks. Officially, they blamed it on structural collapse and teenagers wandering where they shouldn't. But they never explained why so. Many kids went missing, and they never explained why the asylum was demolished within the year. Every brick, every stone erased. But sometimes when I drive past that hill at night, I see it, the windows still glowing. I still remember the field trip like it was yesterday. It was supposed to be just another boring school outing. Our 10th grade biology teacher, Mr. Rowan, had planned a day-long trip to a local nature reserve. The whole purpose was to study wetland ecosystems, take notes on plant life, and maybe collect water samples. Nothing exciting, right? But that day didn't go the way anyone expected. The bus ride out there was the usual chaos. Kids yelling, snacks being passed around, the smell of chips and soda filling the air. I sat by the window, earbuds in, trying to tune everyone else out. I've never really been the group activity kind of person. But when we pulled off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path, something caught my attention. The reserve wasn't where we ended up. I remember looking at the laminated map Mr. Rowan had handed us earlier. It showed a loop trail that went around a marsh, a few observation decks, and then back to the visitor center. But where the bus stopped, none of that matched. We were in front of a set of old wooden steps leading down into a forest thick with pines and oaks. The trail sign at the top was so weather-worn the words were almost illegible. The bus driver frowned, muttering that he'd just followed the GPS coordinates Mr. Rowan had given him. That was the first red flag. But of course, Mr. Rowan brushed it off. He clapped his hands, gave us his usual forced smile, and told us it would be a great opportunity for hands-on exploration. We followed him down the steps, into the forest. The air felt wrong. It wasn't just that the woods were darker than they should have been, it was the silence. No birds, no wind in the branches, just our footsteps crunching over damp leaves. Even the usual chatter from my classmates started to fade as we went deeper. We walked for what felt like an hour before the trees finally opened up, revealing a lake. But here's the thing, there wasn't supposed to be a lake. Not on the map, not on any of the signs. It was huge, stretching out in all directions, the water black and still like a sheet of glass. No ripples, no movement. Just a reflection of the gray sky above. Mr. Rowan seemed surprised too. He muttered something about how he must have taken us off the marked trail, but he insisted it was fine. An undiscovered body of water, he said, grinning like this was some incredible field opportunity. But I noticed the way his smile didn't reach his eyes. We set up by the shore. He had us form small groups, handing out nets and plastic containers to collect samples. My group stayed near the edge, dipping the nets into the water. That's when I noticed it. The water was warm, not just a little warm, uncomfortably so, like bath water that had been sitting out too long. Even stranger, when I pulled my net back up, there was nothing in it. No tadpoles, no algae, no insects, just clear water that clung to the mesh like oil. Across the lake, I saw ripples, small at first, then wider. But there was no wind, no fish breaking the surface, just movement. Did you see that? I whispered to my friend Sam. But when I pointed, the water was perfectly still again. After lunch, things got worse. Two kids, Maya and Jared, wandered a little farther down the shoreline. When they didn't come back after 20 minutes, Mr. Rowan went looking for them. I'll never forget the way he froze when he came running back. His face was pale, eyes wide. "They're gone," he whispered. "They were just there, and then—" He cut himself off, forcing a smile when the rest of us started to panic. "They probably wandered back to the bus," he said. But the bus was miles away, and we all knew it. That's when we heard it, a splash. Loud. From the middle of the lake, every head turned. We watched as ripples spread outward, faster and faster, like something massive had just surfaced. I swear I saw a pale hand break the surface for just a second before vanishing beneath the black water. The silence afterward was unbearable. Mr. Rowan ordered us to pack up and head back immediately. No one argued. We gathered our things and started up the trail, single file. But the forest had changed. The path looked unfamiliar, twisted, like the trees had shifted while we were gone. Some trunks had deep gashes in them, long claw-like marks that hadn't been there before. Sam whispered, "We're lost, aren't we?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to believe we'd find the steps and get back to the bus. But the farther we walked, the less it felt like we were in the same woods at all. And then, we started hearing voices. They echoed faintly through the trees. Maya's voice calling for help. Jared's laugh. Familiar voices begging us to come back. But they weren't coming from the trail. They were coming from the lake. By the time we stumbled back to the water's edge, the sun was setting. The lake was darker than ever, reflecting nothing. Just a void, and then we saw them, Maya and Jared, standing on the opposite shore. Perfectly still. Perfectly silent. Their faces pale, eyes black pits. Someone screamed. Their heads snapped toward us in unison. And in that instant, dozens of pale hands erupted from the water. Clawing at the shore, we ran. I don't remember how we found the steps. I don't remember how we got back to the bus. All I know is that when we finally burst into the clearing, the driver was gone. The bus doors were wide open, the keys still in the ignition. We drove ourselves back to town. The police said we imagined it, that Maya and Jared ran off. Their families still put up missing posters, but the search parties never found them. The map of the reserve never showed a lake. Not then. Not now. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I see that water again. Black. Still. Endless. And sometimes, if I listen closely enough, I hear voices calling me back.